The final nail in the coffin of her old life was not a nail at all, but the sharp, decisive click of a latch. Elias, her husband's brother, closed the farmhouse door in her face, his expression a mask of grim satisfaction. Through the small glass pane, she saw him turn his back, his shoulders squared with the weight of property he had just claimed as his own. The property her husband Thomas had built. The property she had made a home. She stood on the porch with nothing but the dust-colored dress on her back and a small leather pouch in her hand. Inside were $17, the sum total of what Elias and the town council of Providence Gulch deemed a widow's fair portion. $17 for 10 years of her life, for the calluses on her hands from the garden, for the long nights spent nursing Thomas through the fever that finally took him. The entire community had watched the proceedings, their faces a mixture of pity and discomfort. They watched as she was erased from her own life. Beside her, a low whine broke the silence. Borrow, Thomas's lanky hound, pressed his cold nose into her palm. He was all that was left of their shared world, a creature of loyalty in a town that had just shown her the meaning of its opposite. Elias had tried to take the dog too, claiming he was farm property. But Borrow had bared his teeth, a rumbling growl in his chest that made even Elias take a step back. So she had the dog, the $17, and a folded piece of paper. The paper was the cruelest joke of all. It was the deed to a parcel of land Thomas had bought in a foolish moment years ago, a place known to everyone in the gulch as the Sump. It was a low-lying, waterlogged patch of marsh and tangled woods that no one had ever found a use for. It was worthless, a place where the ground soured and the water never drained. It was her inheritance. Mr. Gable, the owner of the town mercantile, approached her, his face etched with a practiced sympathy. "Hilara," he said, his voice soft, "this is a hard thing, a terrible thing. But you can't go out to the Sump. Nothing lives there but mud and mosquitoes. Let me buy you a ticket east. You have family in Ohio, don't you?" She looked at his outstretched hand, then at the faces of the people behind him. They were already turning away, moving on with their lives, her tragedy, a momentary interruption in the day's business. They expected her to break. They expected her to accept the charity, to become a sad story they would tell for years to come. A quiet fire, banked low for years, began to burn in her chest. "No, thank you, Mr. Gable," she said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled. She walked past him, down the steps of the porch she would never climb again, and into the dusty main street of Providence Gulch. Borrow trotted at her heel, a silent four-legged vow of allegiance. She did not walk toward the stagecoach office. She walked into Mr. Gable's mercantile. The bell above the door chimed, announcing the arrival of the woman everyone had just written off. She walked to the counter, placing her small pouch upon it. The jingle of the coins was faint, pathetic. "I need a good axe," she said, her voice clear and ringing in the sudden quiet of the store. "A shovel, 10 pounds of salt, and whatever seeds you have that will keep through a winter." Mr. Gable stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. He saw the resolve in her eyes, a hard, unyielding thing that had no place in a grieving widow. He saw a woman who was not running away, but walking towards something. He slowly turned and began to gather her items. He didn't understand, but he recognized a will that could not be argued with. With her last few dollars, she purchased the tools of a new life. The axe was heavy in her hand, its handle smooth and promising. The shovel was a tool for digging down, for finding foundations. She bundled her purchases in a piece of burlap, tied it across her back, and walked out of the store. She did not look back at the town, at the farmhouse on the hill, at the life that had been stolen from her. She turned her face toward the west, toward the low, swampy lands of the Sump, and began to walk. The dog trotted faithfully beside her, his head held high. The journey was a punishment. The trail that led from Providence Gulch dwindled from a wagon-rutted road to a faint deer track before disappearing altogether into a thicket of alder and willow. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Mosquitoes rose in whining clouds, feasting on her exposed skin. The bundle on her back grew heavier with every step, the straps of the burlap cutting into her shoulders. For 2 days she walked. She slept curled at the base of a pine tree, with Burro pressed against her back for warmth, his soft breathing a comfort in the oppressive silence of the wilderness. She ate nothing, drinking only from the cold, clear streams that trickled down from the higher ground. The world she had known, the world of warm beds, cooked meals, and human voices, felt a lifetime away. She was utterly alone, a single, determined speck, moving through a landscape that did not care if she lived or died. On the afternoon of the second day, the ground began to change. The firm soil gave way to a spongy, yielding turf that sucked at her boots. The trees thinned, replaced by dense stands of cattails and skeletal, waterlogged snags. She had arrived. This was the sump. The sight that greeted her was worse than she had imagined. It was a sprawling, shallow basin of black water and oozing mud, choked with reeds and buzzing with insects. A miasma of rot hung in the air. There was no solid ground to build on, no level place to lay a foundation. It was a testament to nature's indifference, a place forgotten by God. Despair, cold and heavy as a shroud, settled over her. She slid to the ground, the burlap bundle falling beside her with a dull thud. Tears she had refused to shed in town now burned her eyes. The town was right. Mr. Gable was right. Elias was right. This land was worthless. It was a grave. She had traded the illusion of a life for the certainty of a slow, miserable death. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. Burro whined and licked her ear, nudging her with his wet nose, but she could not be comforted. For a long, bleak hour she gave up. But then, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the marsh, a flicker of something caught her eye. It was Burro, sniffing intently at the base of an enormous fallen cottonwood tree that lay half submerged in the muck at the edge of the basin. The tree was a giant, ancient even in death, its trunk wider than a wagon. It must have fallen decades ago, its massive root ball torn violently from the earth, now standing like a jagged earthen wall 20 feet high. Curiosity, a fragile seedling in the wasteland of her despair, began to sprout. She pushed herself to her feet, her joints aching, and slogged through the mud toward the fallen giant. As she drew closer, she noticed something strange. The ground directly in the pit left by the uprooted tree was different. It wasn't the black, soupy muck of the surrounding marsh. It was a pale grayish-brown color, and it looked dry. She reached the edge of the pit and peered in. The colossal root ball formed a natural, overarching roof on one side, a tangled web of thick woody arms coated in dried earth. The massive trunk of the tree formed another wall. The space between them was a sheltered hollow, a deep wound in the earth protected from the wind and the rain. She cautiously lowered herself into the pit. The moment her feet touched the ground inside the hollow, she felt it. A difference. The air was still, completely sheltered from the breeze that whispered through the cattails. She knelt and pressed her palm against the floor of the pit. It was cool, but not the damp, biting cold of the marsh. It was the coolness of deep earth, and as she held her hand there, she felt something else, a faint, almost imperceptible current of warmth rising from below. It was a geothermal seep, a place where the planet's own heat bled slowly toward the surface. She looked at the soil her hand rested on. It wasn't soil, it was clay, thick, dense, heavy clay, exposed by the violence of the tree's fall. Clay for bricks, clay for mortar, clay for sealing a home against the cold. In that moment, everything changed. The sump was not a grave. It was a gift. The town saw a worthless swamp. She saw a sheltered hollow, a natural roof, walls of earth and wood, an endless supply of building material, and a source of gentle, constant warmth. The despair vanished, burned away by a fierce, blazing resolve. This was not the end. This was the beginning. She had work to do. The first day was a blur of brutal, punishing labor. Using the new shovel, she began to dig, expanding the hollow beneath the great root ball. The clay was dense and heavy, and each shovelful was a monumental effort. Her hands, soft from years of domestic work, were raw and blistered within the first hour. By midday, the blisters had broken, leaving weeping sores that stung with every movement. Her back screamed, her arms felt like lead, but she did not stop. She dug until the sun set, her world shrinking to the scrape of steel against earth, the rhythmic thud of clay being tossed aside. Over the next week, a routine formed, dictated by the sun and her own screaming muscles. In the mornings, she used the axe, another alien tool that felt clumsy and dangerous in her hands. She felled smaller, dead trees from the edge of the sump, learning through trial and painful error how to notch them, how to make them fall where she wanted. She then limbed the trunks, her swings growing more confident, more accurate with each passing day. Boro, ever watchful, would often grab the end of a smaller branch and help her drag it toward the pit. His contribution, a small but welcome act of partnership. These logs would become the beams to support her roof. Using her shovel and the sharp edge of the axe, she dug notches into the earthen walls of the pit and leveraged the heavy beams into place, extending the shelter outward from the natural protection of the root ball. It was agonizing work, lifting the logs over her head, her body trembling with the strain. More than once a log slipped, crashing down and narrowly missing her. But each one that settled into place was a victory, a tangible piece of her future. Section. The afternoons were for the clay. She discovered that by mixing the dense gray clay with water from the marsh and some of the fibrous reeds, she could form crude, heavy bricks. She laid them out in rows in the sun to bake, turning them each day. Her first batches cracked and crumbled, but she learned, adjusting the mixture, finding the right consistency. Soon she had hundreds of pale, hard bricks stacked and ready. Using a thicker slurry of the same clay as mortar, she began to build walls within the excavated pit. She built them up against the earthen banks, creating a smooth, insulated interior. The back wall of her dwelling was the earth itself, the source of the geothermal warmth. Against this wall, she began her most ambitious project, the hearth. For this, she needed stone. The nearest creek was half a mile away, its bed littered with smooth, rounded stones worn by millennia of flowing water. She made endless trips, carrying 2 or 3 heavy stones at a time in a sling made of burlap. The weight was immense, the journey repetitive and exhausting. Her body transformed, the soft lines of a farm wife hardening into the corded muscle of a laborer. She stacked the stones against the earthen back wall, using the clay mortar to bind them, slowly, painstakingly, building a fireplace and a chimney that vented up through a natural fissure she had discovered in the root ball. While the shelter took shape, she also built the systems that would sustain her. Just inside the entrance to her dugout home, where the ground was lowest, she dug a shallow well. The marsh water, filtered through layers of sand and clay, seeped in, creating a small, clear pool. She lined the well with her hardest-baked bricks to keep the walls from collapsing. The water was cool, clean, and because it was underground and fed by the seep, it would never freeze. For food, she turned the marsh itself into a resource. She hauled buckets of the rich black muck from the sump, mixing it with sand from the creek and nutrient-rich leaf mold from the forest floor. She spread this manufactured soil in raised beds inside her shelter, near the stone hearth, where it would get the most warmth. In this subterranean garden, shielded from the coming frost, she planted the precious seeds she had bought, potatoes, carrots, onions, and hardy winter greens. It was a desperate gamble, an attempt to grow food in near darkness, armed with nothing but faint geothermal heat and a stubborn refusal to starve. After a month of relentless work, the basic structure was complete. It was less a cabin and more a part of the earth itself, a burrow dug into the side of a dead giant. The roof was a patchwork of logs, covered with a thick layer of sod, and then topped with a dense thatch of cattail she had harvested from the marsh, woven into tight bundles. It was ugly, primitive, and the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. But she needed more than shelter. She needed life. She had been setting snares, catching the occasional rabbit, but it wasn't enough. She needed a sustainable source of food. So, with a bundle of cured rabbit pelts, she made the long journey back to Providence Gulch. Her arrival caused a stir. People stopped and stared. This was not the broken widow who had left 2 months before. Her face was tanned by the sun, her hands were calloused and stained with clay, and her eyes held a new, unsettling confidence. The whispers followed her as she walked to the mercantile. They called her the Sump Witch, or Cattail Ilara, the names a mixture of mockery and a new, grudging curiosity. Mr. Gable's jaw dropped when she walked in. He had assumed she was dead. She said nothing, simply unrolled the rabbit pelts on his counter. They were well prepared, the fur thick and soft. She traded them not for flour or sugar, but for 2 scrawny laying hens and a tiny, runt-of-the-litter piglet. "What in God's name are you going to do with livestock in a swamp?" he asked, unable to contain his disbelief. "They won't be living in the swamp," she answered simply. The journey back was even harder, coaxing and carrying the frightened animals. When she finally reached her home, she settled them into a small, connected chamber she had dug out next to her main living space. It was a tiny, underground barn, warmed by the same geothermal heat and the shared wall with her hearth. The chickens began scratching in their dirt floor immediately, and the piglet burrowed into a pile of dry leaves, content. As she sat that evening, the first fire crackling in her new stone hearth, the sound of the animals shuffling nearby, a profound sense of peace settled over her. Boro lay at her feet, his tail thumping softly on the packed earth floor. Outside, the autumn wind began to howl, a preview of the winter to come. But inside her earthen home, it was warm, it was safe, and it was hers. Every stone, every log, every brick was a testament to her will to survive. The world had cast her out, and she had responded by building a new one from the mud and clay. The mockery from Providence Gulch solidified into a local legend. Elias, her brother-in-law, was the primary author of the tale. At the mercantile and after Sunday service, he would hold court, describing his foolish sister-in-law living in a mud hole, her roof made of weeds. "Cattail Ilara," he'd say with a dismissive laugh, and others would join in. The name stuck, becoming the town's shorthand for her stubborn folly. They pictured her shivering in a damp, miserable hovel, surrounded by filth, and the image reinforced their own sense of security in their sturdy, timber-framed houses. One afternoon, a hunter named Brant, known for his arrogance as much as his skill, decided to see the famous Folly for himself. He found her clearing a drainage ditch, her face smudged with dirt. He stood on the edge of the pit, looking down at her home with open contempt. "Heard you were living like a badger in a burrow," he called down, a smirk on his face. "Doesn't look like much. That cattail roof will leak like a sieve come the first snow." Ilara paused, leaning on her shovel. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "It keeps the wind out," she said, her voice even. "The wind is the least of your worries, woman. It's the cold that will kill you. When the deep freeze comes, this hole will be your tomb." He spat a stream of tobacco juice near her feet. "You should have taken Gable's charity." With that, he turned and left, satisfied that he had confirmed the town's judgment. Ilara watched him go, then turned back to her work. His words didn't anger her. They were irrelevant. He saw a hole in the ground. He couldn't feel the deep, abiding warmth rising from the earth. He couldn't see the ingenuity of her systems. He saw weakness and folly because That is what he expected to see. As autumn bled into winter, her life settled into a deep and solitary rhythm. The world outside grew hard and cold, but her world shrank to the warm, dim space she had created. Her days were a cycle of simple, essential tasks. At dawn, she would rise and tend the fire, adding logs to the embers that glowed all night in the stone hearth. The thermal mass of the stones and the earthen wall behind them held the heat, releasing it slowly, creating a constant, stable warmth that permeated the entire dwelling. After stoking the fire, she would tend her animals. The 2 hens were now laying eggs, precious white spheres she collected each morning. The piglet was growing fat on kitchen scraps and roots she dug from the forest floor. They lived in their attached enclosure, sharing the warmth of her home, their soft noises, a constant, living presence in the silence. Next, she would check her underground garden. In the faint, perpetual twilight of the pit house, illuminated by the fire's glow, green things were growing. It was a miracle of stubborn life. The carrots and potatoes swelled in their earthen beds, and the kale plants were lush and dark. The constant, low-grade geothermal heat kept the soil from freezing, allowing for a slow but steady winter harvest. The rest of the day was for maintenance. She chopped wood, stacking it in a massive, orderly pile in a sheltered alcove near the entrance. She checked her snares, repaired the thatch on her roof, and cleared the snow from the chimney vent. Her life was a closed loop of work, sustenance, and shelter. She was completely alone, but never lonely. Boro was her shadow, her confidant, her guard. The quiet pride of her self-sufficiency was a better companion than the pitying chatter of Providence Gulch. Her systems faced smaller tests before the great one. An early, unseasonable thaw sent a torrent of meltwater pouring into the sump. Her carefully dug drainage ditch, which Brant had mocked, channeled the water away from her home, keeping her dry while low-lying fields near the gulch were flooded. One night, a pack of hungry wolves, drawn by the scent of the pig, circled her dwelling. Their howls echoed in the frozen air. Boro stood at the door, a furious barrage of barks erupting from his chest, his hackles raised. But the door, built of thick planks, salvaged from the fallen cottonwood, held firm. The wolves could find no purchase on the earthen walls. After a frustrating hour, they moved on, leaving her and her small flock untouched. Each test overcome was another layer of confidence, another validation of the choices she had made. She was not just surviving, she was prevailing. Then, in the heart of January, the sky turned a strange, bruised purple, and the air grew deathly still. The old-timers in Providence Gulch would later call it the Great Freeze of '83. It began not with a blizzard, but with a cold so profound, so absolute, that it felt like a physical presence. The temperature plummeted, far below anything the town had ever experienced. Then the snow began, driven by a wind that did not howl, but screamed. The wind was a hammer, battering the wooden houses of the gulch. It found every crack, every seam, turning homes into ice boxes in a matter of hours. The snow came down not in flakes, but in a blinding, horizontal torrent that buried everything in its path. The world outside vanished, replaced by a roaring white chaos. It was no longer weather, it was a siege. Inside her pit house, Ilara barely noticed the change. The screaming of the wind was a dull, distant moan, muffled by feet of earth and sod. The immense weight of the snow on her roof only added to the insulation, sealing her in even more securely. Her fire burned steadily in the stone hearth, the chimney drawing perfectly. The air inside was warm and still, smelling of wood smoke, damp earth, and cooking onions. She fed her animals, checked her garden, and added another log to the fire. While the world above was being torn apart, her small subterranean kingdom was at peace. In Providence Gulch, confidence shattered. The structures and systems that had defined their safety were collapsing. Mr. Gable's well-built mercantile, the pride of the town, had its great front windows burst inward by the pressure of the wind, showering his stock with glass and snow. The roof of the meeting hall groaned under the weight of the snow, threatening to collapse. The cold was the true enemy. It was a thief that stole the heat from their homes faster than they could generate it. Chimneys, contracting in the unprecedented freeze, cracked and failed. Families huddled together in a single room, burning furniture to stay alive, their precious firewood stockpiles, meant to last a normal winter, dwindling with terrifying speed. Livestock, left in barns that were now no better than open sheds against the Arctic blast, began to die, their bodies freezing solid where they stood. Elias's sturdy farmhouse, the one he had boasted of while mocking Ilara's burrow, was a fortress of ice. Frost coated the inside of the walls. Every breath hung in the air as a visible cloud. His wife, Sarah, and their 2 children were wrapped in every blanket they owned, their faces pale and pinched with cold. Their youngest son, Daniel, had developed a cough that rattled deep in his small chest. They were running out of firewood. The security they had taken for granted was a cruel illusion, and the wilderness they had scorned was now inside their home, poised to claim them. The town was wrong. Their entire way of life was wrong. The crisis had lasted for 8 days when Boro began to bark. It was not his warning bark for wolves, but a series of sharp, questioning yelps directed at the door. Ilara quieted him with a hand on his head, listening. Over the dull roar of the wind, she heard a faint, desperate scratching sound. It was the sound of a human hand, weak and freezing. She pulled back the heavy bar on the door and opened it a crack. A blast of impossibly cold air and stinging snow shot inside. A figure, completely covered in snow, stumbled forward and collapsed onto her floor. It was a woman. Ilara quickly slammed the door shut and barred it again, sealing out the storm. She rolled the figure over. It was Sarah, Elias's wife. Her face was blue with cold, her lips cracked and bleeding. Ice was frozen in her eyelashes and hair. She was barely conscious, her breathing shallow and ragged. Ilara dragged her closer to the fire, pulling off her frozen shawl and gloves. She chafed Sarah's hands, forcing warm broth from her cookpot between her lips. Slowly, Sarah revived, her eyes fluttering open. They widened in shock as she took in her surroundings. She was not in a filthy, freezing mud hole. She was in a space that was warmer than her own house had been in a week. She saw the tidy living area, the glow of the fire on the stone hearth, the impossible sight of green plants growing in a corner. She heard the soft clucking of chickens from the adjoining chamber. She smelled food. "Daniel," she rasped, her voice a raw whisper. "My boy, he's sick. The fever. We have no more wood, Ilara, not a stick left. Elias, he is too proud to ask." Her eyes filled with tears of shame and desperation. "We are going to die." Ilara looked at the woman who had stood silently by while her life was dismantled. She saw the face of the community that had mocked her, that had named her Cattail Ilara, and sentenced her to death in this very spot. A cold, hard knot of bitterness tightened in her stomach. She could send her away. She could let them face the consequences of their pride and cruelty. It would be justice. But then she looked at Sarah's face, no longer the wife of a prosperous farmer, but simply a terrified mother. She thought of the sick child, coughing in the freezing dark. She looked at her own massive stack of firewood, enough to last her another month. She looked at her stores of preserved food, her winter garden. She had built this world not just to survive, but to live. And what was a life if it did not choose compassion over vengeance? The choice was clear. It was not about what they deserved. It was about what she was capable of. "Rest," Ilara said, her voice quiet but firm. "Get warm." She pulled on her heaviest coat, a crude thing she had stitched together from rabbit pelts. She wrapped her feet in burlap sacks over her leather boots. She went to a corner of her dwelling where a small, sturdy sled she had built for hauling logs was leaning against the wall. She began to load it. She piled it high with split, dry logs from her stockpile. She added 2 of her thickest woven blankets, still warm from being near the hearth. She packed a basket with potatoes, carrots, and a small slab of salted pork from the pig she had butchered weeks earlier. Sarah watched her, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What are you doing?" "Your son needs to be warm," Alara said, not looking at her. She whistled for Boro, who came immediately, his tail wagging, sensing the urgency. She tied a length of rope to his collar and the other end to the front of the sled. He would help her break a path through the deep drifts. She opened the door again, and the storm clawed at them, a living beast of wind and ice. The journey to Elias's farm, normally an hour's walk, was a brutal, life-threatening ordeal. The snow was waist-deep in places, the wind a solid wall that stole her breath and tried to tear the sled from her grasp. Boro strained ahead, a dark shape in the white chaos, his strength and instinct her only guide. It was a harrowing trek through a world that wanted her dead, all to save the family of the man who had cast her out into it. When they finally reached the farmhouse, it looked like a tomb. Snow was drifted halfway up the walls. There were no lights, no smoke from the chimney. Alara pounded on the door. It was opened by Elias. He looked 10 years older, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow with defeat. He stared at her, then at the sled piled high with firewood, and his proud facade crumbled. He helped her haul the wood and supplies inside. The house was frigid, the air sharp and painful to breathe. In the main room, his sick son, Daniel, was wrapped in a pile of blankets, his breathing a shallow, rattling sound. Alara said nothing. She went straight to the fireplace, cleared out the cold ash, and with her own tinder and kindling, expertly built a new fire. As the first flames caught and began to crackle, casting a warm, flickering light across the frozen room, Elias watched her, his face a mask of stunned humility. The fire blazed, and a sliver of warmth began to push back the oppressive cold. Alara checked on the boy, laying a calloused hand on his forehead. The fever was high. She turned to Elias. "He needs constant warmth. This house is too big, too cold. You cannot keep the heat in." Elias just nodded, his gaze fixed on the fire she had built with the wood she had hauled through a storm he would not have dared to face. He looked at this woman, his sister-in-law, whom he had robbed and exiled. She was strong, capable, and alive, while he, in his sturdy farmhouse, was on the verge of freezing to death. The irony was as bitter as the cold. When the storm finally broke 2 days later, the world was a changed place. The sun shone on a landscape of impossible white drifts and profound silence. Elias, his son now breathing easier by the fire, knew he needed more wood. He followed the deep trench Alara and Boro had carved through the snow back toward the sump. He had to see the place he had mocked for so long. When he reached the great fallen tree, he saw the wisp of smoke rising from the cattail roof. It looked just as primitive as he had imagined. But when Alara opened the door and let him in, he stepped out of the blinding, frozen world and into another reality. The warmth hit him first, a deep, gentle heat that seemed to rise from the very floor. It wasn't the scorching, dry heat of a roaring fire, but a stable, living warmth. His eyes, accustomed to the glare of the snow, struggled to adjust to the dim interior. He saw the glowing stone hearth, the orderly stacks of supplies, the neat earthen walls. He heard the chickens and the pig, alive and content in their adjoining pen. Then he saw the garden. In a corner of the dwelling, under the faint light, was a bed of green, living plants, kale, onions, leafy greens, all growing in the dead of winter in a hole in the ground. He stared, utterly dumbfounded. He could not reconcile the town's story of the sump witch with the evidence before him. This was not a hovel. It was a sanctuary. It was a masterpiece of survival, a system so perfectly integrated with the earth that it had rendered the deadliest storm in memory irrelevant. He turned to look at Alara. She was watching him, her expression calm, without a trace of triumph or malice. She had saved his family. She had brought them warmth and food when he, the proud landowner, had failed completely. The full weight of his arrogance, his cruelty, his monumental foolishness crashed down upon him. His composure broke. He slumped onto a stool, burying his face in his hands. "We were wrong," he choked out, the words muffled and thick with shame. "My God, Alara, we called you a fool. We laughed at you. We were the fools." Alara let the silence hang in the warm air for a moment. She could have recited a litany of his sins. She could have demanded an apology or payment or her husband's farm back. But she did none of those things. Vengeance was a luxury she had no use for. She had built her life on foundations of pragmatism and grace, and she would not abandon them now. She walked over to her cookpot and ladled a steaming portion of vegetable stew into a bowl. She placed it on the small wooden table in front of him. "Your boy needs to be warm," she said, her voice soft but steady. "This house is not safe for him. Bring him and Sarah here. There is room." It was not forgiveness. It was a practical solution, an offering of sanctuary that was more powerful than any sermon. It was the ultimate vindication, delivered not with a triumphant shout, but with a bowl of hot stew and an act of quiet, unassailable grace. Elias looked up at her, his eyes filled with a shame so profound it would change him forever. He had tried to destroy her, and in response, she was offering to save him. In the days after the Great Freeze, Providence Gulch was a town humbled. The storm had broken more than just roofs and windows. It had broken their certainty. When the survivors emerged, they found a world altered not just by snow, but by a new truth. The stories began to circulate, first as whispers, then as open declarations. Elias, his family sheltered in Alara's home, confessed his folly to anyone who would listen. The hunter, Brant, told of his mockery with a shame that burned his cheeks. Alara's home became a focal point. People made the trek out to the sump, not to gawk, but to learn. They came with offerings, a bag of flour, a side of bacon, and asked to see how she had done it. They marveled at the warmth that rose from the ground, at the cleverness of the chimney, at the miracle of her winter garden. The nickname Cattail Alara was still used, but now it was spoken with a reverence that bordered on awe. It was no longer an insult, it was a title. She taught them. She showed them how to read the land, how to use the earth itself as an ally against the cold. Her home, the burrow beneath the fallen cottonwood, became a landmark, a testament to the fact that true value is often hidden, waiting to be discovered by those with the eyes to see and the will to work. Years passed. Alara never moved back to town. Her home at the sump expanded, a network of warm, interconnected rooms dug into the earth, her gardens flourishing, her livestock healthy. She became a quiet pillar of the community, a source of wisdom and practical knowledge. Travelers passing through carried her story with them, the tale of the woman who was cast out with nothing and built a fortress from a swamp, the woman who had tamed the winter that had broken everyone else. In the end, her legacy was not about a new way of building. It was about a different way of being. It was a story of quiet defiance in the face of injustice, of finding strength in what others discarded, and of the profound moral courage required to offer grace to those who have wronged you. It was a lesson written not in books, but in clay and stone, in the stubborn green life she coaxed from the dark earth. One evening, an old woman with hands as tough as leather and eyes as clear as a winter sky stood at the entrance of her home. She watched the sunset, painting the cattails of the marsh in hues of gold and orange. Her faithful dog, a descendant of the loyal Boro, rested at her feet. The air was cool, but her home behind her radiated a gentle, constant warmth. She had been stripped of everything, and in return she had gained the entire world. She had built not just a shelter, but a life on her own terms, a life of unshakable peace.